Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always assume the stories people tell are just exaggerated accounts of real-life creepiness. That changed last week. I work part-time at a small, family-owned antique shop in my town. It's not a glamorous job, but I like the quiet, and the old items have a charm I've grown fond of. The shop is tucked into a corner of a cobblestone street that sees very little foot traffic, especially after dark. Last Friday, my boss, Mrs. Hartley, asked if I could close up. She had a family emergency and promised me a nice bonus if I stayed late. It seemed simple enough. Lock the doors, check the register, turn off the lights. I'd done it before, so I didn't think twice. The trouble started around 9 p.m. just as I was finishing the final sweep of the store. The bell above the door jingled. I froze because I had locked it an hour earlier. "Sorry, we're closed," I called out, my voice wobbling. No reply. I stepped out from behind the counter to see who had entered, but the store was empty. The door was shut, locked just as I'd left it. The bell swayed gently as though someone had passed through, but no one was there. I laughed nervously to myself and chalked it up to my imagination. This place was old. Maybe the door wasn't as secure as I thought. I double-checked the lock and went back to tidying. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the old grandfather clock in the corner. It ticks loudly, and its groaning mechanism has spooked me before. But this wasn't ticking. It was a soft, raspy whisper like someone murmuring just below their breath. I followed the sound through the maze of shelves, past dusty books and porcelain dolls. It led me to the far back of the store, where Mrs. Hartley kept the older, rare items. The whisper stopped as soon as I reached the section. I turned to leave when a loud crash shattered the silence. A gilded mirror had fallen off the wall, landing face up on the floor. Its glass was intact, but my reflection wasn't. In the mirror, I saw myself, pale and wide-eyed, but there was something behind me, a figure cloaked in shadow, standing just over my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I grabbed my bag, left the mess for the morning, and bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard it again, a whisper clear as day this time. "Don't leave me. I've never locked a door faster in my life." The next morning, I told Mrs. Hartley about what happened. She laughed it off, saying the shop had a history of odd occurrences but nothing harmful. That didn't comfort me. I quit on the spot. A week later, I was walking past the store when I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the display window, among the vintage knickknacks and antique furniture, was the gilded mirror. After seeing the shadowy figure in the window, I started avoiding that street altogether. The antique shop wasn't far from where I lived, but I found excuses to take longer routes just to avoid it. A small price to pay for peace of mind, I thought. But the unease didn't stop. It began with my dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in the store. The aisles stretched endlessly, shelves bending and twisting in impossible ways. No matter how far I walked, I'd always end up in front of the mirror. The reflection wasn't mine, though. It was its. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the whisper still echoing in my ears. "Don't leave me." One morning, after another restless night, I found something waiting for me on my doorstep, a small, ornate box. I didn't own anything like it, and the way it was wrapped, perfectly tied with a thin black ribbon, made it clear this wasn't some random delivery mistake. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside. The box smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like the antique shop. Inside was a bundle of old photographs, the kind you'd find in a flea market. They were faded, edges curled, but the faces were disturbingly clear. At first, I didn't recognize anyone in the photos, just solemn-faced people in old-fashioned clothing, posing stiffly for the camera. But then I saw it. The shadowy figure. It was in the background of every photo. Sometimes it stood at a doorway, other times in a window. In one picture, it loomed directly behind a family seated for a portrait. I flipped through the images faster and faster, my heart racing. The last photo stopped me cold. It was May. I was standing in the antique shop, behind the counter, just like I had a week ago. But the shadow wasn't behind me, it was beside me, its hand resting on my shoulder like we were old friends. I threw the box across the room, scattering the photographs everywhere. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but what would I say? That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in my living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would do any good. The hours crawled by, and just as dawn began to creep through the blinds, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was different. Closer. "Why did you leave me?" The room turned ice cold. The knife slipped from my trembling hands as I looked toward the source of the voice. The gilded mirror from the shop was propped against my wall. I hadn't brought it here. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. Its eyes were wrong, dull, empty, and black as the void. The shadowy figure stood behind it, and this time, it stepped forward. I don't remember screaming, but my neighbors told me they heard it. When the police arrived, I was curled in a corner, rocking back and forth. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces around me. They asked if I wanted to press charges, but against who? What could I say? The mirror was gone when I went back to my apartment. So were the photographs. I've moved since then, far away from that town, from that shop, from anything that could remind me of what happened. But sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I swear I see the shadow. For a while, things were quiet. I kept telling myself it was over. I moved across the country to a new city, changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and even legally changed my name. I wanted nothing left of my old life to track me down, but I guess some things don't care about borders or names. The first sign came a few weeks ago. I was unpacking a box of kitchenware in my new apartment. It was the last box, one I knew I had it packed carefully because I'd been in such a rush to leave. I pulled out plates, mugs, a whisk, and then at the very bottom, an old photograph. It wasn't mine. I recognized it immediately. It was one of the pictures from the box I'd found on my doorstep, the one with the shadowy figure standing in the background. My hand started to shake so badly I dropped it, the photo landing face up on the floor. I thought I'd destroyed everything, burned the photos, smashed the mirror, but here it was. And worse, this time the shadowy figure wasn't standing in the background. It was closer, almost reaching the edge of the frame. I threw the photo in the trash and took the entire bag out to the dumpster that night. I thought it was over. A few days later, my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door. She was a sweet older woman, the type who bakes cookies for new tenants. But today, she wasn't smiling. "Sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but do you have someone staying with you?" "No," I said, confused. "Why?" Her face paled. "I could have sworn I saw someone in your apartment last night. Tall, wearing black. They were standing by your window, just staring out." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced a weak smile. "Oh, no, it's just me. Maybe it was a shadow or something." She nodded, clearly unconvinced, and left. That night, I stayed awake again, every light on. I told myself she was mistaken, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I decided to install security cameras in my apartment. It was an impulsive decision, but I wanted proof. I set one up in the living room, another in the hallway, and the last in my bedroom. I didn't really expect to catch anything. I wish I hadn't. The footage from the first night was mostly uneventful, me pacing back and forth, sitting on the couch, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. But around 3 a.m., the living room camera picked up movement. A shadow. It wasn't clear at first, just a flicker near the edge of the frame. But then it moved. It stepped into view, tall and thin, its form hazy like smoke. It didn't have a face, just an unsettling blankness where one should be. It stood there for hours, motionless, staring at the bedroom door. My bedroom door. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called a priest, a psychic, anyone I thought might help. Most of them didn't take me seriously, and the ones who did just gave me vague advice about cleansing my space or protecting my energy. I tried everything they suggested: sage, salt, prayers, even burning candles. Nothing worked. The thing didn't leave. Last night, I reached my breaking point. I packed a bag and decided to leave again, but as I opened the door to leave, I froze. There, propped against the wall in my hallway, was the gilded mirror, the same one I destroyed back at the antique shop. Its surface was cracked, spiderweb fractures splitting across the glass. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't alone. The shadow was there, its hand pressed against the glass as if it were trying to step through. And then, for the first time, it spoke. "You can't run." I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up on the floor, my bag still by the door. The mirror was gone, and I'm writing this from a motel, miles away from my apartment. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. It always does. If you ever come across a gilded mirror in an antique shop, or anywhere, please, for your own sake, walk away. A few years ago, I worked as a freelance photographer, and one of my clients was a quirky artist named Marisol. She painted abstract pieces that were either mesmerizing or unsettling, depending on your perspective. She rented this old attic studio in a historic part of town, a building that had been a boarding house in the late 1800s. The place had character, with creaky wooden floors, arched windows, and beams so low you had to duck in places. It was the kind of spot you'd see in a movie and think, wow, what a cool space. But in person, it felt heavy. Marisol Marisol had hired me to take photos of her latest series for a gallery submission. The first time I walked in, I immediately noticed the odd smell. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered, a mix of damp wood and something metallic. I chalked it up to the age of the building and didn't think much of it. Marisol was a little eccentric, but she paid well, so I agreed to shoot her work over a couple of afternoons. On the second day, I was alone in the studio while Marisol ran to grab us coffee. The light was dim because the weather had turned gloomy, and the small desk lamp she left on wasn't cutting it. I decided to move the lamp closer to the canvas I was photographing. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering. I froze and listened. Nothing, just the sound of rain starting to tap against the windows. I shook it off and went back to work, but a few minutes later, there it was again. This time, it was clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It wasn't coming from the windows or the hallway. It was coming from the floor. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the wood. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging against a chalkboard, but muffled. My stomach turned, and I shot to my feet just as Marisol walked back in, coffee in hand. "You okay?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just nodded and mumbled something about the storm making weird noises. She seemed satisfied and went back to work on a canvas in the corner. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd catch Marisol glancing over her shoulder like she'd heard something too. Finally, as I was packing up my gear, I decided to ask her about it. "Hey, do you ever hear strange things in her?" She paused, her paintbrush hovering mid-air. "What kind of strange things? Like whispering or scraping?" Her face went pale. She set the brush down and gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, that's just the building settling. It's old. Creaks and groans all the time," and her words didn't match the way her hands were trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, trying to rationalize them. The next morning, I got a text from Marisol. "Hey, can we reschedule? Something came up." I didn't hear from her for weeks after that. When she finally reached out, it was to ask if I still had the photos. She wanted to submit them to the gallery because she wasn't going back to the studio. She wouldn't say why, and I didn't push her. I sent her the files and decided to drop the whole thing. A few months later, I ran into another artist who used to rent a space in the same building. I casually mentioned Marisol's studio, and his face darkened. "You didn't hear," he said. "They found a hidden crawl space under the floorboards in that attic. The police think it was used to hide people or bodies. No one knows for sure." After hearing that chilling revelation from the other artist, I couldn't get it out of my head. The crawl space under the floorboards, used for what exactly? I wanted to forget about it, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those whispers again. I told myself it was just my imagination and old building making weird noises. That's all it was, right? A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to drive past the building just to see if it was still in use. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. A for-lease sign hung crookedly in one of the lower windows. The attic lights were off, but my mind filled in the memory of the dim glow from Marisol's desk lamp. I almost drove away, but something made me park and get out. Standing in front of the building, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to leave. But instead of listening, I walked up the steps and peered through the window on the main floor. The interior looked abandoned, with dust covering the wooden floors and debris scattered around. There was no sign of anyone, but I swear I could feel eyes on me. I backed away quickly, heart pounding, and almost tripped on the cracked pavement. As I turned to leave, I noticed a faint outline of what looked like a child's handprint smudged on the glass. It was too high up to belong to an actual child. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank, leftovers from when the place was still occupied. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I had the worst dream of my life. I was back in the studio, standing over the spot where I'd heard the whispering. In the dream, the floorboards were loose, and I could see a dark gap underneath. As I bent down to look closer, cold, pale hands shot out and grabbed my wrists, pulling me toward the opening. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The next day, I got a text from Marisol. It was strange because we hadn't spoken since I sent her the photos. Her message was short and cryptic: "Stay away from the building. It knows you." I stared at my phone, heart racing. I texted her back, demanding an explanation, but she didn't reply. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. The whole thing felt like a bad joke, but her warning stuck with me. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that the building was slated for demolition. Apparently, the owners had decided it wasn't worth the hassle of trying to rent it out anymore. I felt a twisted sense of relief, thinking maybe whatever was in there would finally be gone for good. The night before the demolition, I had another dream. This time, I was outside the building, watching as a wrecking ball swung into the attic. The walls crumbled, revealing not just the crawl space, but something worse. There were faces, pale, sunken faces, pressed against the inside of the walls, mouths open in silent screams. They weren't just in the crawl space. They were part of the building. I woke up gasping, my chest chest tight with terror. The next day, I checked the news, hoping to see an article about the demolition, but there was nothing. I searched online, but the only mention of the building was a small forum post from someone who claimed they'd heard whispers coming from the rubble after it had been torn down. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the whispering again. It's faint, like it's coming from the floor beneath me. I tell myself it's just my imagination. I keep telling myself that, but I don't think I really believe it. The whispers didn't stop after that night. They were constant, but every now and then, in the dead of night, I'd hear them soft and unintelligible, almost like they were coming from somewhere far away. I told myself it was nothing, old pipes, a draft, or maybe just the echoes of my overactive imagination. But the more I ignored it, the more persistent it became. One evening, I came home to find my bedroom door ajar. I live alone, and I was certain I'd shut it that morning. My heart started pounding as I slowly pushed the door open. Everything seemed normal at first glance. My bed was made, my things were exactly where I left them, but when I turned to leave, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a smudge on the inside of my window, a faint handprint, almost identical to the one I'd seen on the glass at the building. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no balcony, no way someone could have reached the window from outside. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I thought about calling someone, a friend, the police, anyone, but what would I say? Hey, I think I'm being haunted by a whispering attic. I'd sound insane. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the building's history. I spent hours scouring local archives and old newspapers. What I found made my blood run cold. In the late 1800 seconds, the building had been a boarding house, just as I'd heard. But what I didn't know was that it had a dark reputation. Several tenants had gone missing over the years, their disappearances never solved. One article mentioned rumors of a secret space beneath the attic, where some believed the landlord had hidden the bodies. The story didn't end there. Decades later, the building was turned into an art studio. Multiple artists complained of hearing strange noises, whispers, footsteps, even the sound of breathing when no one else was around. One artist, a sculptor, reported finding small, childlike handprints pressed into the wet clay of her unfinished work. She moved out the next day. I felt sick reading this. It was as if the building had absorbed all the fear and pain of those who had disappeared, and now it seemed to have followed me. That night, I was determined to stay awake. I sat on my couch, every light in the apartment blazing, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Around 3 a.m., the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they were closer, almost like they were coming from just behind the walls. Then, the scraping began. It sounded like nails dragging across wood, coming from the floor under my feet. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before I could dial, the lights flickered and went out. The whisper stopped. The apartment was silent, oppressively silent. I sat there in the darkness, phone clenched in my hand, too terrified to move. And then I felt it, a cold, gentle breath against the back of my neck. I ran out of the apartment without looking back. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that it was the middle of the night. I just kept running until I reached my car. I drove to a friend's house and spent the night on their couch, shaking and unable to explain what had happened. I moved out the next week. I didn't go back for most of my things. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that apartment again. I've tried to start over, to put it all behind me. I used to run track and cross country, so training runs were part of my routine. Our town had a bike path that ran for miles, cutting through the outskirts and dipping into an older, industrial area. It wasn't the safest part of town, but it was broad daylight, and I was with my friend Jesse. We figured we'd be fine. The path eventually narrowed into a tunnel that passed under an old overpass. It wasn't particularly long, but it always gave me a weird feeling, like I was being watched. The walls were covered in graffiti, and sometimes you'd see broken glass or beer bottles. People joked it was a hobo hangout, but I'd never seen anyone there before. That day, Jesse and I reached the tunnel just as the wind picked up and clouds rolled in, making it a bit darker than usual. I slowed down, instinctively cautious, but Jessie rolled her eyes. "It's just a tunnel," she said, jogging ahead. I followed her in, the sound of our shoes echoing in the confined space. Halfway through, I heard it, a sharp scrape, like metal on concrete. It wasn't us, we were moving too smoothly. They stopped. Jessie stopped too, turning back to me. "What?" she asked, irritated. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. We both stood still, and then we heard it again, this time louder. Scrape, drag, and scrape, drag. It came from deeper in the tunnel, from the shadows we hadn't yet reached. Jessie's confidence faltered. "Probably just a squirrel or something," she muttered, but I could tell she didn't believe it. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding. Jessie stayed behind me, gripping my arm. As we moved closer, the sound stopped. Silence. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. Low, raspy, and sing-song. "Don't stop. now. You're almost here. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Jesse let out a small scream and started pulling me backward, but I couldn't move. The voice came again, louder this time, so close. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw him, a man crouched against the wall, almost blending into the graffiti. He was filthy, his clothes hanging off him in rags, and his head was cocked at an unnatural angle. He held a long metal pipe, the end of it jagged and rusted. He smiled at me, a grin too wide to be human. "Run," Jesse screamed, yanking me so hard that I stumbled. The man stood up in one fluid motion, taller than I expected, and took a step toward us. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the tunnel, sprinting back the way we came. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him running after us, his heavy footsteps pounding on the concrete. He was fast, faster than anyone should have been. We didn't stop until we were back in the open, where other runners and cyclists were passing by. Only then did I look back. The tunnel was empty. We told the police, but they didn't find anyone. The officer who took our statement said there had been reports of someone harassing people on the bike path, but nothing this extreme. I never ran there again. Jesse moved away a year later, and we don't talk about it anymore. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every creak in my house, every shadow outside my window made my heart race. My parents brushed it off as paranoia, and maybe they were right, but Jesse and I both knew what we'd seen and heard wasn't normal. About a month later, Jesse called me out of the blue. She sounded panicked, her words spilling out so quickly I could barely understand her. "Sir, I swear it's him. Slow down," I said, my stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" "I'm staying with my cousin for the weekend," she said, her voice trembling. We were walking to the corner store, and I saw him. He was just standing there at the edge of the parking lot, staring at me. I didn't know what to say. The idea that this man had somehow found Jesse miles from where we'd seen him was too much to process. "Did he do anything?" I asked. "No, but," she cut herself off. "I just know it was him. That smell. I can't forget it." I tried to calm her down, but honestly, I wasn't sure what to believe. Was it possible he'd followed her, or was her mind playing tricks on her like mine had been doing? The next day, I got a text from Jesse. He was outside my cousin's house last night. "I'm going home early." I called her immediately, but she didn't pick up. That was the last I heard from her for weeks. When I finally got through, she was distant, brushing off my questions and saying everything was fine, but I could tell it wasn't. Meanwhile, strange things started happening to me too. It started small. Footsteps behind me when I walked home from school, though no one was there when I turned around. My dog, Max, would growl at the window at night, staring at something I couldn't see. Once, I found the back gate to our yard wide open, though I was sure I'd locked it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. It was faint, like fingernails on glass. My heart leapt into my throat. My bedroom was on the second floor. I stayed frozen in bed, too scared to move. The tapping stopped, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, coming from outside. "Don't stop now. You're almost here." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering to the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but by the time the officers arrived, there was no sign of anyone outside. No footprints in the dirt below my window. Nothing. The police didn't take me seriously. They chalked it up to a prank or a bad dream. My parents didn't believe me either, but I knew. It was him. Jesse and I eventually drifted apart, but I heard through mutual friends that she moved states not long after high school. I can't say I blame her. As for me, I stopped running. I stopped going anywhere alone, and I never ever walked by tunnels. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint sound of tapping, followed by that voice. Years passed, but the fear never fully went away. I moved to a different town for college, started a new life, and did my best to bury the memories. Jesse and I lost touch entirely, and I convinced myself that whatever happened back then was over. For a while, it worked. I even started running again, sticking to well-lit parks and avoiding anything that felt remotely isolated. But the paranoia never left me completely. I always carried pepper spray, kept my earbuds out, and made sure someone knew where I was going. Then, during my junior year of college, it happened again. It was late autumn, and the days were getting shorter. I had an evening class that ran until 7 p.m., and by the time I walked out of the building, it was already dark. The campus was mostly empty, but I figured it wasn't a big deal. I'd made the walk back to my dorm 100 times before. I was about halfway there when I noticed something. A sound, faint at first, like distant footsteps, but as I kept walking, it grew louder. It wasn't steady, though. It had that same uneven rhythm I'd heard all those years ago. Scrape, dragon, scrape, dragon. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, I turned around. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty sidewalk and the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. But then I spotted him. He was standing at the edge of the light, half hidden in shadow, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. His grin was the same, too wide and too eager, and in his hand was something long and metallic, a pipe, or maybe a crowbar. I couldn't tell. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He took a step forward, the scrape of his weapon on the pavement echoing in the quiet. "Don't stop now," he rasped, his voice cutting through the cold night air. "You're almost here." That snapped me out of it. I turned and bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My dorm was only a few blocks away, and I prayed I'd make it before he caught up to me. When I reached the building, I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed against it, gasping for air. The security guard at the front desk stared at me, alarmed, but I couldn't explain what had happened. My mind was spinning, my body trembling. I finally managed to choke out, "There's a man outside." The guard grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but of course, by the time he got there, the man was gone. I stayed locked in my room for the rest of the night, shaky with fear and trying to make sense of it all. But the worst part, the next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to leave my room, I found something waiting for me. On the floor outside my door was a piece of paper. It had one word scrawled across it in shaky, uneven letters: soon. I moved out of that dorm by the end of the week, transferring to a different campus across the state. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and made sure no one could find me. I work part-time at an aquatic center, mostly handling maintenance shifts after hours. It's a quiet gig, and honestly, I enjoy the solitude. The pool after dark has this calm, echoey vibe that feels like being inside a giant seashell. One night, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something odd. The water level in the main pool was lower than usual, nothing drastic, maybe an inch or two, but it was noticeable. It didn't make sense since the pumps and filters had been fine earlier. I figured it was just a glitch and went to check the filtration room. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the pool, where the main drain usually is, was a staircase. It spiraled down into what looked like complete darkness. I froze, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. There had never been stairs there before. I'd cleaned this pool countless times. I knew every tile, every crack. Against my better judgment, I leaned over the edge to get a closer look. The water rippled faintly, almost as if something was moving down there. I told myself it was just the pool's filtration system kicking on, but my gut was screaming that it wasn't. I radioed my coworker, Mark, who was in the office. When I described what I was seeing, he laughed and told me to stop messing around. "Stairs in the pool." "Yeah, okay, buddy," he said. Frustrated, I decided to prove it to them. I grabbed a flashlight and dipped it into the water. The beam barely penetrated the darkness below the staircase. I couldn't see the bottom. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the pool's long net pole. I poked it toward the stairs, and the moment it touched them, I swear I felt a pull, like something was trying to yank the pole out of my hands. I dropped the pole and stumbled back. The water turned, and I could hear it sloshing even though I wasn't touching it anymore. Then I heard a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural groan, like metal grinding against metal, but alive. It reverberated through the whole pool area. I bolted to the office and dragged Mark out to sea. Of course, by the time we got back, the water was completely still. No stairs, no strange noises, just the usual main drain, sitting there like nothing had ever happened. Mark gave me endless grief about it, calling me paranoid and tired, but I knew what I saw. I refused to work another night shift after that. A week later, I quit altogether. It's been a couple of months since I left that job, but the dreams haven't stopped. They're getting worse. At first, it was just me staring down at the staircase. Now, in the dreams, I'm standing on the stairs. The water feels thick and heavy, like I'm wading through syrup, but I'm always moving down, step by step. I never see the bottom, but I know something is waiting for me there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but last week, I woke up with my feet soaking wet. My bedroom was dry, and there was no explanation. My shoes, socks, everything was bone dry too. Just my feet, soaked to the skin. That's when I started digging. I needed answers. I looked up the aquatic center's history and found something unsettling. Decades ago, before it became a pool, the building was part of a larger facility, a hospital to be exact. Specifically, it was a mental institution with a reputation for less than ethical practices. The pool area had been part of the basement where the institution kept its most difficult patients. I couldn't find many details, but I did come across an old newspaper article about a massive flood that destroyed part of the hospital. The basement was completely submerged, and several patients and staff were never found. The article mentioned a structural anomaly in the floor that might have contributed to the collapse, but it was vague. It stuck with me, though. What kind of anomaly could cause a flood like that? Despite my fear, I had to go back to the pool. Not officially, I wasn't about to ask for my old job back. Instead, I decided to sneak in after hours. It wasn't hard, the security system was outdated, and I still remembered the codes. The place was eerily quiet at night, just like I remembered. The smell of chlorine hung in the air, and my footsteps echoed across the tile. I made my way to the main pool, heart pounding. It looked normal, calm, still water reflecting the dim emergency lights. For a moment, I thought I was crazy. Then I saw the ripples. They started in the center of the pool, faint at first but growing stronger. The staircase appeared again, slowly materializing out of the darkness below. My breath caught in my throat. This time, it wasn't empty. Something was coming up the stairs. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could hear it. The same grinding, guttural sound from before, but louder, angrier. The water swirled violently, splashing onto the deck as whatever it was climbed higher. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the parking lot. When I looked back, the building was completely dark, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to come back. That was 2 nights ago. I haven't told anyone, not even my family, who would believe me, but I think it knows where I live. Last night, I woke up to the sound of dripping water. My bedroom floor was soaked, and there were wet footprints leading from my bed to the door. They weren't mine. They were too big, and they were still wet. I didn't sleep last night. Every sound, every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I barricaded the door to my bedroom with a chair and stayed up with the lights on. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was some lingering nightmare or hallucination. But the soaked footprints were real. The water on the floor was real. Whatever was in the pool had followed me home. Today, I decided to call Mark. He might have thought I was messing around before, but I needed him to believe me now. I was shaking when I dialed his number, rehearsing how I'd explain everything without sounding insane. But when he picked up, I barely got 2 words out before he interrupted me. "Dude," he said, his voice tense. "I was going to call you. Something weird is happening at the pool." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There was an accident last night," Mark said. "A lifeguard stayed late to finish up some paperwork. The cameras showed him going into the pool area around midnight, but ... he never came out. I felt like the floor had been yanked out from under me." "Did they find him?" "Sort of." Mark hesitated. "The morning crew found his shoes and clothes near the edge of the pool. No sign of him, though. They drained the pool this morning to look for him, but what? There was no water in the pool." Mark whispered, "No, just the staircase, and they don't go down there. No one does." My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "Mark, listen to me. You have to get out of there. Whatever is down there, it's not safe. It's not just a pool, it's, I don't know, some kind of gateway. Mark sounded skeptical, but there was fear in his voice, too. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not sticking around to find out. I already gave my notice this morning." "Good," I said. "Stay away from that place. Promise me." He promised, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not for me. Not for anyone who had been there. Whatever was beneath the pool wasn't going to stay contained. That night, the dreams came back, but this time they were different. I wasn't alone. I saw the lifeguard, his face pale and distorted, standing at the bottom of the stairs. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth moved like he was trying to scream, but no sound came out. Behind him, the shadows twisted and writhed, forming something massive. Something with too many arms. When I woke up, I could still hear the faint echoes of splashing water. My window was open, and the smell of chlorine filled the room. This morning, I checked the news. The aquatic center is closed indefinitely due to structural concerns. No mention of the lifeguard. No mention of the staircase. It's like they're trying to erase it, pretend it never happened. But I know better. The staircase is still there, waiting, and I have this horrible feeling that it's not done with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The water, the stairs, the thing lurking in the darkness. I don't know how to stop it. I don't even know if it can be stopped. All I know is that if it comes for me, I'll do whatever it takes to keep it from finding anyone else. I was driving across the country to visit my family for the holidays. It was late at night, around 11:30 p.m., and I was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska on a desolate stretch of the interstate. There were no cars, no streetlights, just me, the road, and an unsettling amount of darkness. I was getting drowsy, and my GPS told me there was a rest stop coming up. I figured I'd pull in, use the bathroom, and maybe grab a few minutes of sleep in my car. As I approached, I noticed how isolated it was. The rest stop sat slightly off the interstate, surrounded by flat fields that seemed to stretch forever. A single flickering light over the parking lot greeted me as I pulled in. The place looked run down but not abandoned. There were a couple of cars parked in the lot, though I didn't see anyone around. I parked near the building and made my way inside. The restroom area was dimly lit and smelled like damp concrete. I was alone, or so I thought. I was washing my hands when I heard faint humming coming from one of the stalls. It was soft, almost melodic, and definitely unsettling. I hadn't noticed anyone else come in, and the place had been dead quiet when I entered. "Hello," I called out, trying to mask the nervous shake in my voice. The humming stopped. I waited for a reply, but none came. I dried my hands quickly and turned to leave when I noticed something that froze me in place. There was a pair of shoes visible under one of the stall doors. Men's shoes, old and scuffed, but they were facing the wrong way. The toes were pointed toward the toilet, as if whoever was in there was standing on it, watching me. My heart started pounding. I debated just running out of there, but something compelled me to glance back one more time. That's when I saw the shoes slide, not step, not shuffle, slide slowly across the floor toward the gap under the door. I bolted out of the bathroom and ran straight to my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to start the engine. As I fumbled with the keys, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure was standing just outside the restroom building, partially obscured by the flickering light. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at my direction. I couldn't make out any features, but something about their posture, too rigid, too unnatural, made my skin crawl. I finally got the car started and sped out of there without looking back. For the rest of my drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd glance at my mirrors, half expecting to see that figure again. I've told this story a few times, and some people think I imagined it or let my nerves get the better of me, but I knew what I saw. I've avoided rest stops ever since and always make sure to keep driving, no matter how tired I get. For years, I thought I could put that experience behind me. I told myself it was just a creepy encounter, something I could chalk up to exhaustion or paranoia. But a few weeks ago, something happened that made me realize I might never escape whatever I encountered that night. It started with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Rest Stop Memories." I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, just one sentence. "Do you remember the shoes?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about the shoes. Not the way they slid across the floor, not the way they were facing. I only ever mentioned the figure outside, the weird humming, and the unease I felt. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. I marked it as spam and tried to brush it off. The next few days, things started to get strange. At night, I'd hear faint humming outside my apartment. It wasn't constant, just a few notes, barely audible. Every time I got up to look out the window, the street would be empty. Then, one night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It wasn't on the front door or the windows. It is coming from my bathroom. My heart started racing as memories of that rest stop flooded back. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, hesitating before opening the bathroom door. The room was empty, but the mirror was fogged up as if someone had been in there, breathing heavily. And there, in the condensation, was a single word. "Why?" I backed out of the bathroom, my phone trembling in my hand. My mind raced. Why what? Why did I leave? Why didn't I stay? I didn't have answers, but one thing was clear, I wasn't imagining this. I decided to stay with a friend for a few nights, but the humming followed me there. The final straw came a week later when I found a pair of old, scuffed men's shoes on my kitchen floor. They were facing the wrong way. I packed a bag that night and drove to a motel hours away. As I sat in the room, trying to think of what to do next, I realized something that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The shoes weren't there when I left my apartment. Who, or whatever, was tormenting me wasn't just leaving ominous signs. It had been in the car, with me. I don't know how to make it stop, or if it ever will. All I know is that every time I hear that faint humming or see a shadow move where it shouldn't, my heart skips a beat. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if they'll be there when I open them. I couldn't just live like that, waiting for the next shoe to drop, literally and figuratively. I needed answers. After another sleepless night in the motel, I decided to go back to where it all started, the rest stop. The thought made my skin crawl, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. Whatever this thing was, it clearly wasn't going to leave me alone until I faced it. I planned the trip carefully. I packed supplies, flashlights, a crowbar, even salt. I made sure to leave during the day and picked up a friend, Greg, who had a knack for debunking paranormal stuff. He thought the whole thing sounded like a bad dream, but he agreed to come along for the ride. By the time we arrived arrived at the rest stop, it was dusk. The place looked just as eerie as I remembered, maybe worse. The flickery light in the parking lot was still there, as if it hadn't been fixed in years. Greg, always the skeptic, shrugged. Creepy vibe, sure, but you're probably just tired. Let's check it out. We walked inside, and the air immediately felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. The restroom was still dimly lit, the same damp smell lingering in the air. I half expected to hear humming the moment we stepped in, but it was silent. Too silent. Greg went to inspect the stalls while I stood near the sinks, heart pounding. There's nothing here, man, he called out. His voice echoed unnaturally, as if the room was larger than it should have been. Lebio. He stopped mid-sentence. Greg, I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I walked toward the stalls, gripping the crowbar in my hand. The door to the last stall was slightly ajar, and I could see Greg's feet inside, motionless. Greg, this isn't funny, I said, my throat tightening. I pushed the door open, and my stomach turned. Greg was standing on the toilet, his back to me, his head tilted at an impossible angle. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his body twitched like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. Before I could react, a low, guttural humming filled the room. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Greg turned slowly to face me, his eyes wide but lifeless. His mouth opened, and in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the crowbar. Greg, or whatever was controlling him, stepped down from the toilet, his movements jerky and unnatural. I turned to run, but the bathroom door slammed shut on its own. The lights flickered, and the humming grew louder, almost deafening. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. I screamed for Greg, but his body convulsed and collapsed to the floor. The shadows seemed to pull him toward the last stall, where they swallowed him whole. I don't remember how I got out of there. One moment I was in the restroom, and the next I was in my car, speeding down the interstate. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. Greg was gone. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. When I went to the police, they didn't believe me. They said the rest stop had been abandoned for years and no one had reported seeing another car there in a long time. The nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes I hear Greg's voice in my dreams, calling for help. Sometimes I hear the humming, soft but insistent, as if it's trying to draw me back. I know I'll never go back to that rest stop again. This happened about 5 years ago when I was visiting a traveling fairground with my younger sister, Ellie. We were in a smaller town at the time, the kind of place where events like this are a big deal. The fair had the usual attractions, bumper cars, fried food stands, and a slightly sketchy looking Ferris wheel. Ellie wanted to try everything, and since she was only 12 at the time, I kept a close eye on her. As the evening wore on, Ellie begged me to check out the maze of mirrors. I was hesitant. It looked like one of those cheap, tacky setups, but she wouldn't stop pestering me. I gave in and bought 2 tickets. The attraction was tucked into the back corner of the fair, away from the brighter rides and noisy games. The lights were dimmer here, and I noticed that not many people were lining up. The guy at the entrance, who I assumed was the operator, barely glanced at us as he took our tickets. He was tall, almost too tall, and his eyes didn't quite focus on anything as he muttered something about finding the exit. The moment we stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air was stale, and the mirrors were smudged with what looked like handprints and streaks of something darker. Ellie was giggling, running ahead, but I stayed close. The reflections distorted us, twisting our faces and bodies into strange, grotesque shapes. At first, it was funny, then it wasn't. Lily turned a corner, and I lost sight of her. I called her name, but the maze was disorienting, with every mirror reflecting me a dozen times over. The echoes made it hard to pinpoint where her voice was coming from. Lily, stop messing around, I shouted, trying to sound calm. Then I saw her, sort of. Her reflection was in one of the mirrors, her back to me. I sighed in relief and walked toward her, but something wasn't right. The way she was standing, completely still, didn't seem like her. She wasn't giggling anymore. Ellie, I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, but her reflection moved. It turned to face me, but it wasn't Ellie. The figure had her clothes, her hair, but the face was wrong. It was smiling, way too wide, and the eyes were too big, almost bulging out of its head. I froze, unsure if it was some kind of warped reflection or a trick of the light. Then it raised a hand and waved at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Behind me, I heard Ellie's actual voice. She was calling for me, her voice panicked. Ambient, I shouted, spinning around to follow her voice. But every time I turned a corner, I ended up back at the same mirror, staring at the not Ellie, who was now grinning ear to ear. Its lips moved, but the sound didn't match. It whispered something I couldn't make out, and then it started tapping on the glass. From the inside, at that moment, Ellie burst out of another corridor, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my hand, and we ran. I don't know how we found the exit, but when we did, the operator was gone, and so were most of the fairgoers. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Ellie refused to go to any fairgrounds after that, and honestly, I don't blame her. For a while after that night, Ellie and I tried to put the experience behind us. She told me she barely remembered what happened inside the maze, just that she got lost and panicked. I didn't push her for details. It felt easier to pretend it was just a weird, one-time scare, but things didn't feel right at home. The first incident happened a week later. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror when I saw it. A handprint smeared faintly in the fog glass. It wasn't from me. I hadn't touched the mirror. The hand was smaller, like Ellie's, but it wasn't her. She'd already gone to bed. I told myself it was nothing. I cleaned the mirror and didn't mention it to anyone, but the next night, I noticed something else. My reflection wasn't quite in sync. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. When I reached for my toothbrush, my reflection's hand hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before moving. I stared at it, unblinking, until I convinced myself I was overtired and imagining things. Ellie started acting strange, too. She'd been having nightmares, waking up crying and saying she'd seen the other me in her dreams. I'd hear her whispering to herself in her room, and when I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd just shrug and say, no one. She avoided mirrors altogether, even covering the one in her room with a blanket. One night, about 3 weeks after the fair, things escalated. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling on my phone, when I heard Ellie scream from her bedroom. I bolted upstairs and found her curled up on her bed, staring at her covered mirror. She was here, she sobbed, pointing at the blanket. She was in the mirror, but she wasn't me. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I felt sick. I pulled the blanket off the mirror, half expecting to see something, but it was just us, just my reflection holding Ellie, both of us pale and shaken. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about our reflections looked off. That night, I stayed in Ellie's room. She fell asleep eventually, but I couldn't. Around 3 a.m., I caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and my blood ran cold. There were two Ellies in the reflection. One was sleeping peacefully in her bed, just like the real Ellie, but the other Ellie was standing behind me in the reflection, her head tilted slightly, her lips curled into that same too wide grin I'd seen in the maze. I didn't move. I didn't dare blink. The second Ellie stared at me, her grin widening as she slowly raised a hand to tap on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Ellie we needed to get rid of the mirror. She didn't argue. We took it out to the backyard and smashed it with a hammer. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I still feel like I'm being watched sometimes, like there's another version of me just waiting for the right moment. The worst part, a few days ago, Ellie showed me something she found under her bed, a shard of the broken mirror. I don't know how it got there. I threw it away immediately. A couple of days after Ellie found the shard, I started noticing it again, that eerie feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the bathroom mirror or in the reflection of the TV when it was turned off. Always fleeting, like the kind of thing you could convince yourself was just a trick of the light. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. Then one night, it got worse. Ellie and I were eating dinner in the living room, watching some mindless reality show to distract ourselves. Everything felt almost normal for the first time in weeks, but as I glanced at the dark window behind the TV, my stomach dropped. There, in the reflection, I saw us. Except it wasn't us. The reflected version of me was staring directly at the window, not at the TV. And Ellie, she wasn't moving at all, just sitting there, her head slightly tilted, her mouth stretched into that same awful grin. I turned to look at her, panicked, but she was fine, happily munching on her food, completely oblivious. I turned back to the window. The reflection hadn't changed. Ellie, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, don't look at the window. Just get up, go to your room. She frowned at me, confused. What? Why? Just go. My voice cracked, and she finally listened, hurrying upstairs. The moment she was out of sight, I grabbed the nearest blanket and threw it over the window, covering the reflection. My heart was racing, and I had no idea what to do. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the reflection, how it seemed separate from us, like it had its own awareness. I decided to do some research, hoping to find an explanation, something to make sense of this madness. I scoured the internet, reading about everything from urban legends to paranormal phenomena. Most of it felt like nonsense, but then I stumbled across an old forum post that made my blood run cold. The user described an experience eerily similar to mine, a visit to a traveling fairground, a strange maze of mirrors, and unsettling encounters with distorted reflections afterward. The post ended with a warning, don't let them out. I couldn't sleep after reading that. What did it mean? Let who out? The reflections? Were they trying to escape? And if so, how? The answer came the next evening. Ellie and I were in our room, packing up anything with a reflective surface, mirrors, picture frames, even her tablet. I was determined to eliminate anything that could act as a window to whatever was stalking us. Suddenly, Ellie froze, staring at the small vanity mirror we'd overlooked. wait. She's here, Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. She's watching. I turned to the mirror, and there she was, Ellie's reflection, but not quite. Her eyes were too wide, and her movements didn't match Ellie's at all. She raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Then, slowly, the hand started to push through. "Rud," I screamed, grabbing Ellie's arm and yanking her out of the room. As we bolted down the hallway, I heard the sound of glass cracking and splintering behind us, followed by a faint, sickening giggle. We ran outside, not stopping until we were in the middle of the yard. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see something in the windows, but everything looked normal. Too normal. What do we do? Ellie whispered, clutching my arm. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go back inside. Not until I figured out how to stop this. It's been 3 days. Ellie and I are staying at a motel for now, but I can't shake the feeling that we didn't leave it behind. Last night, I caught a glimpse of something in the motel bathroom mirror, a face, not mine, smiling at me. I think smashing the mirrors made it worse. It's not just confined to one reflection anymore. It's everywhere now. Windows, water, even the faint shine of polished surfaces. They're getting closer, and now Ellie's acting strange again. She's been whispering to herself the way she did before, but this time, when I asked who she was talking to, she didn't shrug it off. I worked part-time at a small, run-down mill in my town. Most of the shops were closing, and only a handful of stores were still open. My job was at a family-owned stationery shop on the first floor, tucked away in a corner. It was usually dead quiet after 7 p.m., which is when my shift would end. One night, my boss asked me to stay late to help organize some old inventory. I didn't mind. I needed the hours. Around 9 p.m., I realized I hadn't seen anyone walk past the store in almost an hour. The silence felt heavier than usual. I decided to take the trash out to the mall's dumpsters, which were located in the basement. This was a section of the mall most customers didn't even know existed. The elevator that led there was ancient and grown with every floor it passed. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights. The basement smelled damp, and the walls were lined with old posters advertising stores that hadn't been in the mall for decades. The dumpsters were in a wide, open area just outside a pair of heavy double doors that led to a maintenance corridor. I dragged the trash bag over to the dumpster and tossed it in. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the maintenance doors. I froze. It sounded like metal dragging against concrete. I told myself it was probably just a janitor or something and quickly headed back toward the elevator. Before I could press the button, I heard the scraping sound again, closer this time. It wasn't my imagination. It was rhythmic, like someone deliberately dragging something heavy. I turned around and stared at the double doors. One of them was slightly ajar now, though I could have sworn both were closed when I came down. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Then I saw it. A pale, bony hand slowly slid through the gap in the door, followed by another. Whoever or whatever it was crawling. The hands were elongated, with fingers that looked unnaturally long. My instincts kicked in, and I jammed the elevator button repeatedly. The scraping turned into a faster, erratic clattering as the thing started pulling itself out of the doorway. I didn't stick around to get a better look. As soon as the elevator doors opened, I jumped inside and hit the button for the first floor. I could hear the sound of something dragging itself across the floor as the doors closed. My heart was racing, and when the elevator finally reached the top, I bolted out and locked up the store as fast as I could. I quit the next day. I didn't even go back for my paycheck. I don't know what was in that basement, and I don't want to know. After quitting, I did my best to forget about the whole experience. I told myself it was probably some maintenance worker pulling a prank or a trick of the light. You know, anything to make it seem less terrifying. But deep down, I knew better. A few weeks after I quit, I ran into a former coworker, Amber, at a coffee shop. She still worked at the mall but was planning to leave soon. I tried to keep the conversation light, but eventually she brought up the basement. "You ever notice anything weird down there?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes betraying unease. I froze. "What do you mean by weird?" Amber hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I had to close up alone the other night, and I went down to the basement to toss the trash. While I was down there, I swear I heard someone whispering my name, but when I looked around, no one was there." My stomach churned. I wanted to tell her everything, but held back. "Probably just her imagination," I said weakly. Amber nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. "Maybe. Still, I've been avoiding that place since. It just feels wrong down there." We said our goodbyes, and I left feeling even more unsettled. Amber's story confirmed what I had been trying to ignore. There was something wrong with that basement. A month later, I heard that the mall had shut down completely. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because no one else would have to deal with that basement. Dread because I wondered what they did with it. Did they seal it off? Did they check it out? Did they find anything? For a while, It was easy to put out of my mind. The mall faded from local memory like all dying malls do. But then, a year after it closed, I stumbled across a news article that stopped me cold. The article was about the mall's demolition. Construction crews had discovered something strange while tearing it down, a hidden room connected to the basement maintenance area. According to the report, the room contained old equipment, what looked like a makeshift living space, and bones, human bones. The article was vague about specifics, but it mentioned that investigators believed the remains were decades old. The most disturbing detail, there were scratch marks all over the walls and floors, as if someone or something had tried desperately to escape. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound of that scrapey metal and the sight of those pale, unnatural hands. Whatever I saw that night wasn't just some prank or figment of my imagination. Sometimes, I wonder if the demolition really got rid of whatever was down there. What if it just moved, found somewhere new to hide? And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound, the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal against concrete. I hope it's just in my head. After reading that article, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with whatever had been in that basement. It lingered at the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch. Weeks turned into months, and I started convincing myself it was over. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the better of me. Then, one night, I was driving home late from a friend's house. It was a quiet stretch of road, no other cars around, and my headlights barely cut through the dense fog that had rolled in. I almost missed it at first, a figure standing on the side of the road. It was hunched over, its back to me, barely visible in the mist. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was probably just some hitchhiker or someone walking home. As I got closer, I slowed down out of instinct, trying to get a better look. That's when it turned around. It wasn't human. The thing was gaunt, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tightly over its face. Its eyes were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to suck the light from my headlights. And those hands, those long, bony fingers, I recognized them immediately. I slammed on the gas, my heart pounding as I sped past it. In my rearview mirror, I saw it start to move, dragging itself onto the road, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it tried to follow me. I didn't dare slow down. My car roared as I pushed it to its limit, the thing disappearing into the fog behind me. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the corner of my room, shaking. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew the truth. It had found me. The days after that were strange. I started noticing things, small but unsettling. Footsteps outside my window at night, scratches on the siding of my house that hadn't been there before. Once, I found my front door unlocked even though I was sure I'd bolted it. And then came the whispers. It started as a faint sound I could barely hear, like wind rushing through the trees. But over time, the whispers grew louder. They came at night, calling my name in a raspy, broken voice. Sometimes it sounded like it was just outside my bedroom door. Other times, it seemed to come from inside the house. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That some pale, skeletal thing from an abandoned mall was haunting me. I knew how crazy it would sound. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I decided to search the house. I checked every room, every closet, under every bed. Nothing. But as I stood in the hallway, I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. The air grew heavy, and the whispers started again, louder this time. They weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from beneath it. I live in an old house with a crawl space. I'd never been down there before, but at that moment, I knew I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking as I pulled open the hatch. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as I aimed my flashlight into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just dirt and cobwebs. But then, in the far corner, I saw them, handprints in the dirt. They were too large, too elongated to be human. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, something pale and thin retreating into the shadows. I slammed the hatch shut and didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers didn't stop. They've never stopped. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. It's been weeks, and the thing is getting bolder. I see it out at the corner of my eye, standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. I hear it scraping against my walls at night, trying to get in. I don't think it's going to stop until it gets what it wants, and I have no idea what that is. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.